Hi, I'm Gareth Kane, and welcome to the Net Zero Business Podcast. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by Ketan Joshi, climate writer, analyst, and advocate, as described on his LinkedIn profile, but certainly one of the more prolific users of social media to communicate climate change, which I hope to get into today. But welcome to the podcast, Ketan.
Hi, Gareth. Thank you for inviting me. It's nice to be here.
It's my pleasure, absolutely. Now, before we dig into all that, I always like to get a bit of background on my guests. So, how did you first get started in sustainability in general and communications in particular?
Yeah, I in sort of 2007, I think, or 2008, I finished my university degree, which was in science, and I just sort of fluttered around for a few years, not really sure what to do with myself. And I started applying for jobs which sounded science-y, and one of those was at a wind farm company, and I actually really knew close to nothing about climate and energy. In particular, I had to really learn a lot, on the job. I wish I had a better origin story, but this was just me stumbling into a job that I thought was somewhat related to my degree. However, once I started that job, I discovered that there was this amazing blend of data analysis and communications work to be done in the energy space and climate space. So, yeah, that was a pretty fortuitous because that was what really got me inspired and passionate was actually after I joined that job, becoming a part of the public debate on climate.
Yeah, and I was just scrolling through some of your LinkedIn posts before we started, and I saw you said you had scars on your back from wind turbine syndrome, which I remember. So, do you want to tell us what, and air quotes, wind turbine syndrome, close air quotes, is and how that
Oh
was
my gosh.
weaponized?
Oh my gosh. I'll try and keep it brief. I it was a big part, it was actually a massive part of my career, and it's so strange to be thinking about it again. So basically, just as an introduction to what it is, this emerged in the sort of early 2010s as a kind of pseudo-scientific health scare around the operation of modern large-scale wind turbines. This was largely in the UK and the US and Canada and Australia. And people were worried essentially that inaudible noise, very, very low frequency noise that you can't perceive consciously, was having subliminal effects on the human body. And basically, when you get a wind turbine and you just measure it and you just sort of say, okay, well, let's just test this, and let's just test humans, who are living near wind farms. Of course, you get negative results. And the reality of the story was actually really that, first of all, there were groups going around telling people this is going to make you sick, and the symptoms were always vague. There were always generally just symptoms of stress, so stuff like headaches and anxiety and sleeplessness. And then also development of those projects was quite bad. So people were alienated and angry, and they felt like they really weren't part of the change that was going on in their community. So you had two things. You had the disinformation, and then you had the sentiment, the anger that drove people to accept it. And so it turned into this massive health fear. Millions and millions of dollars was put into health studies in Australia. It's quite a remarkable story. It's the subject of half of my book, which I published in 2020 with New South Press, University of New South Wales, which was basically on energy justice and climate politics in Australia.
Hmm.
And to me, it represented the whole story of why we need to basically develop wind farms in ways that just doesn't make people angry. Don't give the anti-wind groups the sort of ammunition that they require to spread the disinformation. And the reason that I've gotten back into it recently, where I was posting about it on the weekend, is because data centers, modern data centers, there is a theory emerging that they also cause infrasound health impacts. And to me, it is a really similar story, essentially, of corporations angering communities. It's just that I think that in this case, data centers actually have a very large number of material negative impacts. I've been working a lot on corporate accountability. Maybe we can go into that later. But essentially on emissions and air pollution impacts from modern data center developments. So yeah, look, it's an amazing story, and I was really happy to write about it again.
Yeah, and I speak as I sometimes describe myself as a psychosomatic hypochondriac, in that if somebody tells me I may have an affliction of some sort, I will immediately start feeling it. Whether it's the kids when they were younger would bring home a letter from school saying somebody in the class has got nits, and I would immediately start scratching my head, through to quite a few other imaginary afflictions. So it sort of taps into a primal issue, doesn't it? This misinformation is somebody coins a phrase,
Yeah.
and then suddenly some people start
Yeah. And we
actually
all
experiencing those symptoms.
th- this is a really, really important point. Probably one of the most important actually in that whole area, which is simply that no one's immune. This is not like a anything to do with education or susceptibility or anything like that. No, nobody is immune to this, and that's why it's so important to be responsible.
Yeah,
I guess if you're part of a group that's campaigning against a data center or campaigning against any large infrastructure project, you have to be very responsible and very careful. Even if some right wing fossil fuel industry group or whatever, it will not be as responsible. It is still incumbent on all of us who appreciate science and follow the scientific method and things like that to be careful in how we talk because it can be quite dangerous to warn of something when it's not really a real threat.
yeah, and it's quite amazing how people, and I include myself, as you said, is everybody. I recall going to a sort of offshore wind consultation in Teesside in the northeast of England, where I've been based despite the accent. And one woman was, got up and gave this big speech about how she'd been to Blythe, further up the coast, which was the site of the first UK's first offshore wind farm, consisting of two turbines. And she said when she got off the coach at the marketplace that the noise from these turbines, which were 2 kilometers offshore, were hitting her in the chest. My partner's from Blythe, and we lived there for 3 years. And I was like, I never heard a whisper. Never mind. And it's just amazing
Yeah,
how, and who knows what this woman was experiencing, but it
yeah.
almost certainly wasn't those distant wind turbines.
Yeah, we would often do tour when I worked at a wind farm company in Australia. We would often do tours, and we would actually go out to project. We would take people who were sort of living around developments that we had, and just as much as we possibly could take them to existing wind projects, and you could almost like it was so strange how reliably you could predict how the group would split. So basically, 80% of people would always be surprised at how quiet they are. They think they were basically going in there expecting the sound of a jet engine or like a truck. And you kind of get this very faint whoosh, essentially, even when you are literally standing beneath them. It is remarkable how such a gargantuan machine can be so quiet. It's almost creepy or unsettling how quiet they are. I find them incredible. I obviously remain a huge fan of wind energy. But then basically you had the remaining 20% were skeptical and sort of unwilling to really talk too much about what they were feeling. And then of that remaining 20%, you would always have 1 or 2% who generally would express what you just described, which is that like they would say that they feel physically or mentally affected by the wind turbines. And I think that is just a natural sort of if you're primed, of course, or if you are stressed, you are not really happy, you're sort of in like a situation where you feel like you're kind of being watched for your reaction. It can really, I think that makes people experience something. I don't want to say that they're sort of being dishonest at all, but certainly it's something that is not reflected in the community that lives around wind farm, for instance. Like, uh, you know, the vast majority of people who live near wind farms are just completely unbothered by them, and it's just yeah, this is something that we were just not prepared for. Like I was a data analyst, like a nerd who was there to answer questions about, the grid and energy and stuff like that. And we were not equipped or prepared for, I guess, the pure psychological experience that would occur.
Yeah. So we've gone off quite a tangent there, but going back to your career, what were your next steps after working in the wind industry?
Yeah, look, through that job in the wind farm company, I switched basically from data analyst to communications,
Hmm.
and I've been in communications ever since with, I guess, the tools or the sort of focus on data and engineering and analysis as always a subset of what I do. And so I left that job and I started working with the Australian Renewable Energy Agency, which is a government loans, sorry, not loans, a grants body for early stage research. So I kind of wanted to go from like an established technology to like kind of experimental technologies, which was really, really fun. That was a fantastic job. And then I moved into the Commonwealth Scientific and Industrial Research Organization, which is CSIRO. And they had a data science. I wanted to do a bit of data science comms, and that was a really good job too. Except I was working not so much on clean tech. There was actually a bit of stuff there, but I was also working on like artificial intelligence and robotics, machine learning, energy efficiency, grid optimization, stuff that's really, really, really hard to communicate to a broader public. So that was so cool. I really enjoyed that, and. Then at that point we left my family. We moved to Norway with our little kid in 2019. I finished off my book actually while I was in Norway. I was going to come back to Australia to for publication, but COVID happened, and yeah, after that I joined a corporate accountability role. At a Brussels-based climate NGO called the Global Strategic Communications Council. So they're a network of communications professionals, and they work with other organizations to help do communications. And I was focused on corporate accountability work with them. So that was really cool.
Yeah, it sounds it. And I suppose maybe getting into some of the guts of what I want to talk about today is, we've got these extraordinarily complex systems. And then obviously climate change itself is almost the optimum challenge in trying to communicate very, very complex systems to a public when other people have weaponized the debate by using very, very simplistic ones. So, have you got any examples of sort of successes in that role where you were taking complex technical data and communicating them
Yeah.
to a non-technical audience?
Yeah, I think there's a couple. I'll tell you maybe one about one I've been working on over the past few days, which just because it's fresh in my mind. But it spans across actually pretty much every single role I've been in. And this is basically when you have an incident where a blackout occurs on a grid, a major blackout, and you have some involvement, whether politically or physically, of renewable energy, right? Like wind farms or solar farms. And there's been several blackouts in history where, renewable energy has been implicated through like political rhetoric.
Yeah.
And then you have to basically you've got two circumstances there. The first is generally it's catastrophic, right? So very impactful, wall-to-wall news coverage, very emotionally charged. People are sitting there in the dark. People are in hospitals and you've got diesel gensets running out of fuel. Very, very, very significant event. And then you also have the complicatedness of the grid, of the power grid, which is, of course, probably the single most complex machine in operation in human society today, right? Like something that people have very, very low familiarity with. Lot of horrible jargon, megawatts, reactive power, frequency, voltage. Like this stuff is just absolute nonsense to most people, understandably so. And so the rise of disinformation around blackouts has been a very, very major thing. And I think that I've been this was a quarter of my book essentially. I focused on a big blackout in South Australia in 2016,
Mhm.
and it was a major moment for me personally because I thought I don't ever want this to happen again, right? Like I don't want such an easy exploitation of such a major event for the worse. It changed politics in Australia. Like you see blackouts talked about as if like they're worse than climate change. Like it's really really astonishing. And so I've been working with some organizations to help improve preemptive communications and basically communicate how disinformation occurs in the midst of a blackout, talking to journalists and basically explaining like this is what you're going to see. This time last year, Spain had. This is why I'm working on it because we're at the 1 year anniversary of that blackout.
Yeah.
And we really worked closely with a bunch of journalists to be like, look, this is what you're going to see over the next like 24 hours. I think that we didn't succeed in many cases. I think that generally, the media coverage of that event was lacking in many different outlets and places. But in some places we did succeed, and I think that making sure that the long term stuff is good is more important rather than trying to frantically get things to work on day one or even during the actual blackout. I think that over the longer term, if you kind of look at the headlines and the tone and framing, it actually ended up in the right place, I would say, which is that generally there was critical scrutiny of the theory that renewables caused Spain's blackout. And then when all of the technical reports came out, as we expected, they did not blame renewable energy. Like it was pretty clear for those of us with, technical understanding of those blackouts. Uh, Sorry. Someone's just dumping a huge garbage. Someone's just dumping a huge garbage container right outside the window.
I'm not picking it up, so we
Oh,
can.
good. Oh, good.
So,
It sounds and feels like the earthquake that we experienced in Oslo last Sunday,
all
which
right.
was very creepy. But yeah, look, I think I wouldn't sort of present that as a massive success or a huge win,
Mm.
because it's very patchy. Like you've got it, we're really working against. I guess the lack of understanding of power grids and the lack of understanding of how underinvested they have been, and how a lot of the blame, there is such a massive machine of blame that exists in the midst of an event like that. So that was a big one. I found that really important. And then I guess maybe another example that's a bit more obvious and a bit more understandable has been the role of carbon offsets in greenwashing.
Yeah.
We did plenty of work, in my previous role, and I guess in my sort of current role, I'm scrutinizing some of the role of offsets in Australia. That basically it's not just that they're ineffective as a sort of way of presenting progress on a company's climate report. They're actually can be counterproductive, and that there is a better way to talk about corporate climate action and funding sustainability and better places to put cash. So I think that we did pretty well
Yeah.
in raising public awareness of that industry. Yeah.
Yeah. The Iberian blackout one's an interesting one because obviously it got huge coverage, front page coverage in the mainstream press for a technical issue, and yet Spain's resilience in the face of the current Straits of Hormuz crisis, and they because they have so much renewable energy on the grid, they are riding that out in the way the rest of us aren't. That doesn't make the headlines. So we've got this, a crisis will always cause more headlines and speculation than a good news story, I suppose.
I should shout out to the Guardian who asked me to write about this last week, and they let
I
me
read
write. They did let me specifically write about the very very significant reduction in wholesale electricity prices thanks to the protecting effect of solar in particular. But interestingly enough, in Spain, the after the blackout, the grid operator did, out of an abundance of caution, basically change the settings of grid management such that gas-fired generation did increase a bit, not very much. It's still, at like historical lows, but it was just compared to the previous year. But even that has caused, that was I think that was a sign that Spain should have had much more battery storage and allowing solar power to help control the grid stability as they should have been many years ago. All of those reforms are coming into place, and literally as we're speaking, my laptop's fan is buzzing like crazy because I have a 300 megabyte Excel file of Spain's historical power generation, and I was just looking at it this morning, and you can actually see battery storage starting to like there was when I downloaded the files last year, the battery storage column just had an NA in it, and I suddenly had to, when I downloaded it this morning, suddenly it's not an NA, it's numbers, and that made me very happy. So, it's
Yeah.
good.
Yeah, the battery revolution's huge, and I suppose it's mainly happening behind the scenes. Another example of that again, I just double checked this before, is last March at Heathrow Airport. There was a fire in a substation, the only substation that seemed to be the powering all of Heathrow, and the Telegraph, and I quote the headline: Heathrow forced. Now they did put this in quote, forced to shut down because of net zero, which is still there a year later, even though it was nothing to do with net zero. It was a fire in a substation. And the whole evidence was an anonymous expert who spoke to Richard Tice MP, a climate skeptic, probably the preeminent climate skeptic MP in the House of Commons.
Yeah,
And yet, I couldn't see behind the paywall, but the article's still there, the headline's still there a year
yeah.
later, and yet, it was absolutely nothing to do with net zero whatsoever.
This was something we really noticed. This is something I've noticed right from the start. 10 years ago in the 2016 South Australian blackout, is that disinformation around blackouts is quite diverse. You get the sort of like climate denier groups on Twitter and like other social media platforms, just pumping out nonsense from the second it starts. But you also get traditional media outlets, you get columnists, you get TV presenters, all basically along a spectrum of disinformation and types of disinformation. And so any sort of like plan, like strategic plan that you have to tackle this has to be really really diverse in what you focus on. And in fact, I personally argue pretty strongly that focusing on traditional media is more important than focusing on social media, because the current situation that we're in now is simply that social media is just devastatingly unregulated and it's a total mess. And it would be great. It would be great if a government actually introduced some sort of consequences for a platform allowing the spread of actively dangerous lies, but it's not really happening. Whereas a media outlet, you have a bit more chance of calling up a journalist on the phone and saying, "Hey, this is what you should watch out for, and this is what you should focus on." Yeah,
Yeah.
it's tricky.
Yeah. And the algorithm thing has got very difficult, hasn't it? I remember getting into, creating my LinkedIn profile, my Twitter profile back when I set up my business 20 years ago. And in those days, you built a network of people to communicate with. And that is just completely redundant. And it's all to do with who can sort of tickle the algorithm in the
Yeah,
right way. And we know from revelations from Facebook that if the more anger you manage to stimulate, the the further you get. So, what's your approach to the sort of new world of
yeah.
communication?
I kind of split it out into two eras in my head. There's kind of the 2010s, which was basically mysterious algorithms with secret settings operated by corporations like Meta and LinkedIn and Microsoft now, LinkedIn. And everybody's kind of just scrambling around trying to superstitiously guess what the algorithm wants.
Mhm.
And so you can see examples of this, right? Like, so the way when somebody posts a link on LinkedIn, and they have to bury the link in a comment because they worry that putting the link into the post itself will get you deranked by the algorithm.
Yeah.
And obviously it's not true. Like it doesn't make a difference. And LinkedIn is pretty insistent about that. I always put a link as prominently as I can because I personally like to share other people's work, and I want other people to be recognized, and I want the internet to be somewhere where we share and link to other people's work. And it doesn't seem to be too much of a net bad for my for my posts on LinkedIn. But I think the most important thing is that superstition exists because LinkedIn is not transparent,
Mhm.
and that's pretty bad. that's kind of that era, right? Which is bad enough because it had people scrambling into corners to behave in a certain way that they thought would get their content boosted. And now we're in an era not just where so that still exists. There's still secret algorithms run by companies, but the act of producing content for social media is itself being produced by an algorithm, a secret algorithm, right? So like a chatbot or a text generator or an image generator will produce a post for somebody. You would have seen this on LinkedIn quite a lot, right? Where somebody will produce a post, and everything is reverting to the mean. You sort of have this like very clear, very very noticeable style of language. You have dot points with emojis. You have this weird "it's not X, it's Y" type language, short sentences. It's sort of unreadable. It's very sort of gray and featureless. And that is now we're in a situation where we have two algorithms, one producing the content and the other sorting the content.
Yeah.
And so to be someone in that context who wants to have an authentic voice, I don't want to produce content using an algorithm or a generative AI, and I don't want my content to be delivered to people based on a corporation's secret sorting formula that I will never see in my whole life. Both of those things I actively dislike. And so it's the worst possible time to be me, which is which is strange. But having said that, having an authentic voice, building a network where people subscribe to me and the stuff that I say and do, and my type of analysis that I like to do, is really really important. And so of course, I'm leaning more towards social networks that have a bit more control and are a bit more open. I spend a lot of time on Blue Sky, which is, I guess, Twitter-like, but it has you can basically subscribe to algorithms or create your own. I created a climate-related algorithm called Green Sky, which returns, open source. You can kind of go look at the guts of that algorithm and who's on the list for it and all that sort of stuff. And I think Blue Sky, is not guaranteed to become a massive social media network. It may never, but I love the concept. I love the proof of concept, and I think the more people that can support networks like that. I'm not a newsletter person in that I don't write newsletters myself. I don't create podcasts either. Both of those things I would love to do at some point if I had the time. It's super awesome. But I consume both of those
Yeah.
very, very much like massive amounts, right? Because there's just so many good people producing so much good work. But I find myself getting a little frustrated because, I love newsletters, for instance. But when I start getting it from Substack stopped being a newsletter about a year ago and it became a social media network.
Yeah.
And so it has its own walled garden. It's like begging you to install the app to read a newsletter. It stopped being something that you have an email address and it sends you an email with a bunch of blog posts in it. Like it's not really that anymore now. It wants to become a social media network that has an algorithm and that has a walled garden and it basically replicates the worst of the 2010s. And so like this is something we have to actively resist and encourage where possible people to stick with platforms that have much more organic, naturalistic relationships and networks. People subscribe to what they want. You can have some level of like suggestion and boosting, but it needs to be tuned carefully and really managed. I don't think any social network is doing it particularly well. Maybe Blue Sky, but it's just Blue Sky has its own issues, many of them. So yeah, I think that just resisting the trend, resisting both the algorithmic sorting and the algorithmic creation of content, and making sure that we fight for a better social media space, may be futile. But I'm going to keep doing it because I think there's many others who are fighting for that too. I should acknowledge. Yeah.
Yeah. I just wonder what's going to happen with, you talked about two algorithms, but of course, then there's a feedback loop is that eventually,
Yeah.
it's almost certainly happening already. Generative AI is going to be training itself on the the output of
Yes.
generative AI, and where does that spiral end? Does it spiral inwards? Does it spiral outwards? What's
Uh,
happen? Because then humans will be out of the loop altogether.
Yeah, certainly the risk of what's known as model collapse is very significant, which is basically where you get, as you described, you get these recursive loops. Errors multiply quite significantly. You have to burn a lot more energy to get the same level of accuracy in an answer, or not accuracy, but fidelity to the training. And so, yeah, this is a real. They're really struggling with this problem because social generative AI, the real magic behind it comes from social media specifically. Basically, this training database of human conversation spanning decades now that they fed into these machines. That is why they're so good at replicating the feel of a conversation. Is that the software was basically just trained on the single largest corpus of human text-based communication that exists in all of history. And so, of course, you get a convincing conversation simulator. But what is happening is that that database is becoming polluted with its own outputs. And so I have no idea what actually happens, right? My strong suspicion is that it actually reaches a point where there is no going back. I think it will just get worse and worse and worse and worse until the product simply just becomes not worth using anymore. And authenticity returns as like a value or a priority.
Yeah.
I'll just sit it out until then, I guess. But yeah, it's a worry.
Yeah. Well, my main worry is that people keep saying M dashes are a sign of AI generated, and I use M dashes all the time.
Oh, me too. I love
Yeah,
them. Yeah.
I'm gonna have to I'm gonna have to change my behavior to appear, more human, which is a bit weird. You talking of AI and energy use. You've been
hmm
writing a couple of pieces recently on greenwash from the AI industry.
Yep.
Perhaps you'd like to set forth your position on that.
Yeah, absolutely. The very, very short version is simply that we have good evidence that the current rate of growth of data centers around the world, particularly in the US, UK, Europe, and Australia, is such that it's incentivizing fossil fuel use in a time when we shouldn't be doing that. It's
Yeah.
also incentivizing a bit of renewable energy, but not as much as it's helping fossil fuels. And so the net effect is a negative one. The industry has itself claimed that the technologies that they're developing can help climate. They can basically serve as climate solutions. And so I set out to interrogate that claim in a recent piece of work that was funded by corporate accountability groups and environment NGOs. And what we found essentially is that there's kind of a trick in the language they're using. They talk about AI in very general terms,
Mhm.
but actually, what is going on is that they're referring to a type of AI, a very old and specific low energy type of machine learning or algorithmic system that allows for patterns to be learned. And I actually used a bunch of these back in my old job in the wind power industry when we were trying to do wind forecasting.
Yeah.
And this sort of pattern matching system has been around for a long time. You can run it on a laptop, in the office. And they kind of highlight those types of solutions in their annual technology companies highlight those solutions in their annual sustainability reports. But really, the bulk of the emissions impact comes from what I just described when it comes to the generation of text, images, and videos, which is an intensely energy hungry process simply because, as I mentioned, there is a very, very large data set being called upon.
Mhm.
So training the data, creating that model is itself very energy intensive. And then doing what's known as inference, which is basically when you ask it a question, you say, tell me, what was wind power generation in this year, or generate an image of a wind turbine. That itself is the opposite, right? So it's inferring from the model, okay, the question is this, and I'm going to use my training data to guess what the output would be probabilistically. So it's also why you get a lot of errors, right, from these systems, is because they're not calling upon training data and then accessing that data set and saying, okay, here's a reference to what the training data says. It is just using probabilities about adjacency when like these two things were next to each other in the training data. So the chances are that they're probably going to be next to each other when you've asked me your question. And so you get a lot of errors because probabilistically sometimes that's wrong.
Yeah.
And it consumes a lot of energy because you have to really call on a very, very large data set. So these consumer models are massive. And so what we saw basically is that companies like Google, Meta, Amazon, Microsoft all have rising energy consumption, rising greenhouse gas emissions. Some of them invest in renewable energy. Some of them are even like new projects rather than existing ones. But that is really not very much compared to just the increasing power consumption on the grid. And so what we found is that they were kind of trying to paper over that, by basically saying, "Don't worry, the net effect of all of this is that climate change gets solved," and we think we contend in our report the evidence for that is shockingly weak. The thing that has really emerged since that report came out is that it's not just grid connections that's causing the fossil fuel damage in the US, for instance. There are several gigawatts of new fossil gas construction as in literally under construction, I should say. So not like proposed or not like, some company just trying to talk up their new gas field.
Hmm.
This is something that the International Energy Agency used satellite data to confirm. As in, they looked at the sites of these gas-fired power stations, and there are buildings, and sites being cleared. So this is a real boom in fossil gas power in particular. This is to run data centers on site, so they're actually not connected into the grid, which avoids the problem of angry locals and rising power bills, but it creates the problem of significantly worse local air pollution and greenhouse gas emissions. And so Stand.Earth, for instance, just came out with a report that found Microsoft's total greenhouse gas emissions. Microsoft, not a small company, one of the largest technology companies on the planet, their total emissions would increase by several times if its gas-fired data center projects were to go ahead as they're written, as they're planned. So that is Microsoft's plan essentially. Even if those projects don't go ahead, that is the direction they're taking. And so, yeah, we really. I guess I pitched that report at a time when I felt like there was insufficient focus in the media on this issue and what the companies were doing and why what they're saying didn't make a lot of sense. And I think that since then, since what like sort of around this time last year, I guess is when I came up with this idea for an investigation. I think we've done a pretty good job at helping to draw focus, as many people have been doing, to draw focus to this and put some increased pressure on the companies to be more stringent in when they make a claim.
Yeah. What intrigues me is who's going to pay for all this energy, because we as punters currently can go on ChatGPT and ask it a question. I know there's
Uh-huh.
other things you have to pay for. When I open Microsoft Word now, Copilot fires up and I've never used it. To me, it's like that. I'm of the year of the paperclip, which you had
Yeah.
to work out how to get
Clippy.
rid of because that was the most irritating thing ever. And I think Cory Doctorow, who coined the phrase "enshittification," I heard him ask this question: "Is will the AI industry and all the hype just collapse when investors suddenly realize they're not going to get their money back for?"
Yep.
Because gas-fired power stations, they do not come cheap,
Yeah.
and then
Mhm.
to build, and then you have to pay for the gas. So somebody's going to have to pay for this at some point. And I think that
Yeah.
personally, that's when a lot of this might implode and go back to a sort of more focused use case for AI.
Yeah. It's not just that you have to pay for the gas. The International Energy Agency's latest report, it's called Key Questions on Energy and AI. It's worth reading. And they have a massive section in there on just like maintenance. So turbine blades, when one of those flies off or bends, and you're sitting there and your data center is not grid connected, and you're just like, okay, well now I've got to wait 1 year for a replacement blade because the queue for turbine parts, gas turbine parts, is a year long.
Mhm.
What do you do? Like that's several $billion of investment that is just like every second, every waking hour of your day is just pouring out the door. And it's just a remarkable situation. And so, yeah, as you say, it's not just paying for the energy, it's just the practicalities of the system that they've set up. Like it's really remarkable. And I think basically what happens, it's good that you mentioned enshittification because this will be like sort of like this won't be enshittification for the purposes of squeezing customers for more money. This will be completely mandatory enshittification because their servers do not have enough electrical energy supply to answer a question. And so we are already seeing this. Claude, for instance, this is the chatbot system run by Anthropic, has started introducing time limits. Like basically, you can only use this service between this hour and this hour of the day because otherwise there's too much strain on their servers.
Mhm.
That is not a sign of a company that is managing its resources well.
No.
And I, people pointed to that as a sign that there is high demand for the services provided by Anthropic. To me, that is a sign of inefficiency of Anthropic, right? So basically, like they are offering a software system that is running shockingly inefficiently, and they simply do not have the physical resources to basically run an inefficient business of that scale.
Yeah. Absolutely. And well, there's a gazillion other things we could talk about. One of them that's interesting in the going back to the UK press is that, if a energy intensive industry here in the UK closes a facility, it's all blamed on net zero.
Yep.
Yet the same people seem to be, blowing the trumpets for AI, which will remove a huge number of creative jobs, or
Yep.
has the potential to remove a huge amount of creative jobs, and yet those jobs don't seem so much of a problem.
Yeah, I mean, I talk to many people who are doing, at the community level, who have a data center development near where they live, and that one of the key messages is always that the data center will bring jobs. And it's just an astonishing thing to say when the entire purpose of the computation within that data center is to provide a service that makes people lose their jobs very explicitly. That is the marketing pitch of the companies offering generative AI is to bosses, look how many people you can fire if you subscribe to an enterprise level service from us instead. And so, yeah, it is very hollow and cynical, as you say, politically hypocritical as, this paranoia about jobs and net zero. And then they sort of flip on they turn on their heel and just sort of go, okay, well, yeah, like let's just fire all these people using AI. So it's really, really, it's a source of great frustration and anger for me because I think that it shows that they were basically concern trolling, which is when you pretend to be worried about something
Yeah.
insincerely when it comes to jobs and, in particular, the fossil fuel industry and fossil fuel workers, clean tech workers. All these people deserve much, much better than the sort of silly narratives, as you say. Yeah,
Yeah. I hadn't heard concern trolling. I use the phrase or predatory concern, a variation of predatory delay.
that's great. I
Is
like
that
that.
we people are only being concerned about certain things when they
Yeah,
relate in some way to renewable energy.
that's a
And
good one.
I wanted to ask you about something else. One of the when I first reached out to you to come on the podcast, it was because you put up a post of a letter to people who had just discovered that the sun goes down in the evening and sometimes it's not windy, and asking to fill out all the details of their discovery so that you could inform the world's energy experts as soon as possible. Now, that sort of scathing satire, is that born out of frustration, or again, is that you trying to bend the algorithms to your own?
No, not at all. No, no. It was just a comment I got, and I get these comments, quite frequently. It was funny actually. I get them less and less, right?
Mm,
It feels very much like a blast from the 2010s. But this was basically somebody who said, I'm just trying to remember actually what my original post was about. But somebody replied essentially saying, "What are you going to do when the sun goes down?" or whatever. I think it was about an Australian a report I did on Australia's deployment of battery systems. And yeah, I, I was just like, they always sort of have this tone of revelation about them, and I spend so much time reading the work of or talking to energy researchers who are so profoundly aware of the variations in wind and solar output at every single time level you can imagine, from like centuries to milliseconds, right? Like it's really the level of research going on about the resource of atmospheric kinetic energy and sunlight is so massive. And it's so funny to get these comments from these people who sort of feel like they've just had this lightning strike of revelation about the like changes in sun and wind. And also just yesterday I was mucking around with data from a really wonderful think tank called Ember, who make available all of their generation data, which I rely on pretty much every single day of my life.
We've
And
had, in fact, we've had Richard Black on the pod. So if
oh,
people
have
want
you?
to know more
Brilliant.
about Ember, go back to, I can't, back in September, I think it was,
Yeah.
September. Yeah.
Shout out to
Seasons
Richard,
back.
also
Yeah.
a fan of blackout politics, you know. Yeah, and look, I just made this chart, yesterday, and it was just I should actually post it because I just made it because I was bored and stuffing around. But basically, it's just the share of wind and solar, so not renewables, not like hydro or geothermal, not nuclear or anything, just wind and solar in large countries, with like high energy demand. And I had this moment looking at it. I would love to go back to 2011 and just show that to people and just be like, what do you think? Like, do you think that by 2026, you will have this array of very large, very high energy consumption countries, Spain, Denmark, Australia, United Kingdom. Do you think that these countries will have like higher than 30% share? Or like, what put a pin in this map and show me what kind of share that you think it'll be for wind and solar specifically. And so, because that's the real test, right? Because wind and solar are the ones that with the variations that people gripe about. And it is absolutely just bloody remarkable how far we've come. And it just like so strongly did people insist that it was impossible physically engineering anything. Like it was just impossible to have these levels of wind and solar on isolated power grids. I should just note, like I'm using countries as like the area definition. It would be lovely to have some sort of data source where I could split it out by isolated grids. This is why I refer to Australia so much because they do have an isolated grid,
Right.
and they have a share of oh my gosh, I think it was like 39% wind and solar from the latest data. That's off the top of my head. I need to double check that, but it's massive, and it's 50% renewables in total now for Australia. So it's half. Australia is just on the verge of hitting that halfway point.
Yeah.
And that's remarkable. Like it's just, yeah, like in 2016, after that blackout, it was seen as a vindication of the fears that everybody was warning about. Wind and solar, they're intermittent, they're going to cause blackouts, blah blah blah. And all those people were so not just wrong about the warning, but wrong about, at a scale that is just hard to explain.
Yeah.
Because
Absolutely.
Australia, like, just the success in grids like Spain, Australia, Texas, California, everywhere where wind and solar have been deployed, they've been managed so beautifully and so well. And so, yeah, that I was just joking around, with that thing. Someone actually made a website when I posted that, and they posted it in the comments. You can actually send that website to someone who next comments, by the way, did you know that the sun goes down at night? You can just send them this website. But I think that it's important to be really bold and really strong about this because I think that as a general principle, people warn of the impossibility or infeasibility of energy transition
Hmm.
as a way to stop us thinking about whether it is actually possible or not.
Yeah.
And I'm so happy that it didn't work, for wind and solar. But it is probably true that all of the ridiculous warnings that we get for everything else, like for heavy industry, for transport, for homes, for buildings, every other sector of society where people are just blurting out this warning, they're probably not right about those two, right? Like it's probably we're going to have this moment in like 2036 and just be like, I can't believe people thought that getting rid of combustion engine cars was going to be really difficult. It'll just seem absurd. So yeah.
Well, it's when you get people still spreading conspiracy theories about chemtrails, uh, which it seemed to come late to the whole COVID set of conspiracy theories, which all rolled into one, and then somebody added chemtrails in. And I sometimes wonder if some of this is by satire that people chuck things in and then other people lap it up, because this idea that the vaccine with its microchips wasn't powerful enough, so they had to dose us with chemtrails. And you go, this
Great.
doesn't make any. So, anyway, I've kept you, I've had you on for quite some time. This is absolutely great. But just to try and sum things up, if most of our audience is sustainability managers in medium, large size organizations, roughly speaking, when they're trying to communicate uh, in this sort of world. Do you have any hints and tips that they should adopt?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that really you've got to you have to walk two lines at the same time. One is relatively bold advocacy of the new technologies. I think when you look at, like, sorry to make this an Ember love fest, but
Yeah.
the reports that they do on electrotech and things like that, I think are really good. They're really good advocacy and just sort of bold, unapologetic. This is the new world. This is where it's going. Get with the program. At the same time, you also, when you are in the position of being, a sustainability professional in a company, you also have the power and the influence to criticize the overuse of fossil fuels. And of course, this goes back to AI and data centers and services. Your friendly digital service provider might be offering you a chatbot. You have the capability to say, no, I actually want to know the real footprint of this. I want to know if you can offer me a leaner, more environmentally friendly, local, smaller model that I can run on my computer, or something like that. That gives you the power to say, no, 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 I actually want to use my influence to help push back on the old system as well, because I'm sure, as you know, we are not exiting the old system as fast as we should be. And yeah, it's important to push on both ends.
Fantastic. That's great. You mentioned your book a couple of times. I'm not sure if you gave us the full title. Did
Yeah,
you?
it's called Windfall: Unlocking a Fossil-Free Future, and I tell the story of all of a lot of what we discussed here. Closes off with Australian politics and the bushfires of 2020, the Black Summer bushfires. So yeah, it's worth having a look.
Yeah, because Australia's probably the only country that's had proper climate elections a couple of times, and we don't have time to dig into all that. But yes, that sounds absolutely fascinating. I will chase that down myself. That just leaves me to thank you very much, Ketan, for joining me today. I thoroughly enjoyed that. I thought it was a great conversation. I learned loads from it.
Thank you for having me.